The mop handle was smooth and cool under his palms, a familiar cylinder of lacquered wood worn down by 1,000 nights of this same motion. Forward, back. A lazy figure 8, the gray water sloshing rhythmically in the yellow bucket. It was 2:17 a.m. on the 3rd floor of St. Jude's General Hospital, the cardiothoracic intensive care unit. The air, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, carried its usual sterile cocktail. The sharp tang of antiseptic, the faint metallic scent of blood from a discarded dressing, and the low, ever-present hum of the ventilation system, the hospital's mechanical ghost. Alistair Finch, known to the night staff as Al, the quiet janitor, worked his way down the corridor. He kept his eyes down, a practiced habit of invisibility cultivated over 5 years. He was 48 years old, but the fluorescent lights, unforgiving and stark, carved deeper lines into his face, making him look older. His hair, once a surgeon's neat dark crop, was now mostly silver at the temples, a surrender to time and gravity he no longer fought. He wore the standard-issue gray uniform, the fabric softened with countless washes, the name Al embroidered in blue thread over his heart. It wasn't his name, not really, but it was the one he answered to. His movements were economical, precise. There was no wasted energy, no shuffling gait. He moved with a quiet purpose that seemed at odds with his menial task. The way he angled the mop head to get perfectly flush against the baseboards, the controlled pressure he applied to a stubborn scuff mark, it was the muscle memory of a man accustomed to precision. His hands, when he paused to wring the mop, were the only things that betrayed him. They were long-fingered and elegant, the nails immaculately clean. They were not the hands of a man who'd spent his life with a mop. They were the hands of a craftsman, a musician, an artist, a surgeon. Under the sleeve of his uniform, the worn leather strap of a Patek Philippe Calatrava, a ghost of another life, was a secret weight against his skin. A code blue had blared through the unit an hour ago, a brief, frantic storm of activity that had now subsided into a tense, watchful quiet. Al had waited it out in his supply closet, a small, windowless room that smelled of bleach and floor wax. He knew the rhythms of this place. He knew the sound of a nurse's running footsteps, the difference between the urgent squeak of a gurney's wheels and the lazy roll of a linen cart. He knew the specific pitch of a ventilator alarm, signaling low pressure versus high. He had spent 20 years of his life orchestrating these rhythms, and the last 5 years trying to become deaf to them. As he worked his way toward the central nursing station, a knot of doctors stood under the harsh glow of a large monitor, their voices low and sharp. Al kept his head down, the rhythmic swish-swish of his mop, a cloak of anonymity. He was just part of the scenery, the man who made the floors shine, as invisible as the humming ventilation system. "The pressors aren't holding him," a young resident, face tight with exhaustion, said. "His pressure is still bottoming out with every arrhythmia. We push epi, he gets a run of V-Tach. We give amiodarone, his heart rate drops into the 30s. "What about the echo?" a sharp voice cut in. "Dr. Aris Thorne, the head of cardiothoracic surgery." Thorne was everything Alistair Finch had once been, at least on the surface. Brilliant, confident to the point of arrogance, with a reputation that preceded him into every room. He wore tailored scrubs that probably cost more than Al's monthly rent, thickened walls, especially the septum. Ejection fraction is preserved, surprisingly, but the diastolic dysfunction is profound. It's like the ventricle can't relax. Classic hypertrophic cardiomyopathy presentation, the resident replied, trying to sound certain. Al paused, his mop still. He tilted his head just enough to see the screen from the corner of his eye. It showed a cardiac MRI, a cross-section of a struggling heart. He didn't need to see the name on the chart. He knew the case. A 19-year-old college runner, Leo Dorsey, admitted 2 days ago with shortness of breath and fainting spells. A kid who could run a 4-minute mile now couldn't walk to the bathroom without his oxygen saturation plummeting. "So, we treat for HCM," Thorne declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Beta blockers, maybe consider a myectomy down the line if he doesn't respond. The arrhythmias are the immediate threat. Let's get him prepped for an ablation, pinpoint the source of the VTAC and burn it out." 4 other surgeons and cardiologists nodded in agreement. It was the textbook response. It was logical. It was competent. And it was wrong. Al felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in 5 years. He looked at the image on the screen, the ghostly gray and white shapes that were as familiar to him as his own reflection. The resident had said the walls were thick. They were. But the EKG tracing Al had glimpsed earlier, taped to the glass of the patient's room, had shown the opposite of what you'd expect with that much muscle mass. It had shown low voltage, the electrical signals strangely muted, as if they were struggling to get through waterlogged tissue. Paradox. The word echoed in his mind. Thick walls, low voltage, preserved squeeze, no ability to relax. It wasn't muscle. It was something else. Something infiltrating the heart muscle, making it stiff and unresponsive. He felt a tremor start in his right hand, a faint, insidious vibration. The ghost. He clenched his fist, digging his clean fingernails into his palm until the shaking stopped. He squeezed the mop handle, the solid wood a grounding force. "Stay out of it, Al. It's not your world anymore. You have a promise to keep." His phone buzzed in his pocket, a gentle vibration against his leg. He pulled it out, the screen's warm glow a stark contrast to the cold blue light of the ICU monitors. A picture of his daughter, Lily, smiled up at him, a gap-toothed grin from her school photo last year. The text was from Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor who watched her. "She had the dream again. Called for you. She's sleeping now. Just wanted you to know." The air left Al's lungs in a silent rush. The dream. The one where she was in a dark room and couldn't find him. The one she started having after Elena died. The one that only got better when he promised he would always be there, that he would never leave her. He had walked away from a world of saving lives to save just one. His own. He typed back a reply, his thumb moving with slow precision. "Thank you, Clara. I'll be home before she wakes up, I promise." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The promise. That was his anchor. His job here, the mop, the anonymity. It was all in service of that promise. Be present, be simple, be just Dad. He had traded the godlike power of the operating theater for the sacred duty of making pancakes on a Saturday morning. He had no regrets, but as he glanced back at the screen, at the image of that 19-year-old boy's heart, a heart that was slowly turning to stone, he felt the old world pulling at him. He knew what this was. He had seen it before. He had seen it up close, in the person he loved more than anyone. He had watched it, helpless, as it stole the life from his wife, Elena. Cardiac amyloidosis. A zebra, the doctors called it. A rare disease you read about but almost never saw. A protein misfolding disease where abnormal fibrils deposit in organs, making them stiff and dysfunctional. In Elena's case, it had attacked her heart. The local cardiologists had chased the diagnosis for 6 agonizing months, treating her for everything from coronary artery disease to anxiety. By the time Alistair Finch, the great surgeon who could mend the most broken of hearts, realized what was happening in his own home, it was too late. The amyloid had embedded itself so deeply, her heart was irretrievably damaged. She died waiting for a transplant that never came. And now, he was seeing it again. The same constellation of paradoxical symptoms. The same insidious pattern the textbooks described, but that most doctors never recognized until the autopsy. Thorne and his team were about to perform an ablation, an invasive procedure that involved threading catheters into a heart that was already brittle and electrically unstable. It wouldn't work. Worse, it could trigger an irreversible cascade, a fatal arrhythmia. He gripped the mop handle tighter. "It's not your place. You're the janitor. You have no credentials, no license, no right. You are Al Finney, the man who cleans up spills." He turned his back on the doctors and began to mop again, the figure 8 motion a desperate, repetitive prayer. Forward, back, swish, swish. He could smell the coffee brewing at the nursing station. He could hear the faint beep of a patient's IV pump finishing its cycle. Normal sounds. A normal night. But the image of the MRI was burned into his mind, and the memory of Elena's hand growing cold in his. He stopped. The mop dripped a small puddle onto the gleaming linoleum. He could walk away. He could go home to Lily, make her pancakes, and read about the tragic, unexplained death of a promising young athlete in the local news a few days later. He could keep his promise to his daughter by breaking an older, unspoken one he had made to himself the day he took the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. Walking away now, knowing what he knew, felt like a form of harm. If you believe that people deserve to be seen for who they truly are, not just what their job title says, subscribe now and share this story. Now, back to what happens next. He left the mop and bucket by the wall. His heart was pounding, a frantic, sickening rhythm that mimicked the very arrhythmias he was thinking about. The tremor was back in his hand, stronger this time. He ignored it. He walked toward the knot of surgeons, his worn, rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the floor he had just polished. He was a ghost, stepping out of the shadows. For the first time in 5 years, he was about to speak. Dr. Thorne was pointing at the screen, directing the resident. "Book the EP lab for 0400. I want to map his left ventricle myself. We'll find the focus." "Doctor?" The voice was quiet, calm, but it cut through the clinical chatter like a scalpel. All 5 doctors turned. They looked at Al, standing there in his gray uniform, his hands clasped behind his back to hide the tremor. Their expressions shifted from confusion to annoyance. "What is it?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with impatience. "Is there a spill?" "No, sir," Al said, his gaze fixed not on Thorne, but on the screen. "It's about the patient, Leo Dorsey." A silence fell over the group. The resident, a young man named Ben, looked utterly bewildered. A senior cardiologist, Dr. Lena Hansen, frowned. "I'm sorry. Do we know you?" "My name is Al," he said simply. "I work here, nights." Thorne's jaw tightened. This was a breach of protocol, of the rigid caste system that governed a hospital. "If you have a concern, you can report it to your supervisor. We're in the middle of something critical here." He turned back to the screen, a clear dismissal. "You're about to make a mistake," Al said, the words costing him more than they could ever know. The walls of his carefully constructed anonymity were cracking. Thorne spun back around, his face a mask of disbelief. "A mistake? And you would know this how exactly?" The condescension was thick enough to taste. "Have you been reading medical journals in the break room?" The other doctors shuffled their feet, embarrassed and irritated. This was absurd. Al took a step closer, his eyes never leaving the MRI image. He pointed a steady finger, the tremor miraculously absent for a moment. "You're treating for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy based on the septal thickness, but you're ignoring the EKG, low voltage despite the hypertrophy. You're seeing the diastolic dysfunction, but you're misinterpreting the cause. The ejection fraction is preserved because the walls are thick, not because they're strong. They're rigid. It's infiltrative. The medical jargon, delivered with such quiet authority from the man who emptied their trash cans, was so jarring it stunned them into silence. Ben, the resident, stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. Dr. Hansen's frown deepened, but now it was tinged with thought, not annoyance. Thorne, however, was incensed. Infiltrative? Who the hell do you think you are? You get your medical degree from a bottle of floor wax? Get out of here, now, before I have security escort you out. I've seen this before, Al said, his voice dropping even lower, imbued with a weight of sorrow and certainty that was impossible to ignore. Twice. The first time was in a textbook. The second time, it was my wife. The raw, personal pain in that statement hung in the air, extinguishing Thorne's anger and replacing it with a stunned, uncomfortable silence. Al pressed on, speaking directly to Thorne but loud enough for them all to hear. You're seeing a restrictive physiology that's mimicking HCM. It's not muscle, it's an amyloid deposit. Light chain amyloidosis, most likely, given the rapid progression. The ablation won't work because the arrhythmia isn't coming from a single focus. The entire myocardium is irritable because it's being strangled by protein fibrils. Threading catheters in there. You risk perforation. Or you could trigger an irreversible arrhythmia. You could kill him. Every doctor in the group was now staring at him. The janitor. The man named Al. He had just laid out a differential diagnosis with more clarity and confidence than any of them had. He spoke their language. He spoke it better than they did. Dr. Hansen was the first to break the spell. She looked from Al to the screen, then back again. He's right about the paradox, she said softly, almost to herself. The low voltage. We noted it, but we attributed it to pericardial effusion, even though the echo showed none. It's a classic sign, Al affirmed, his gaze meeting hers. A flicker of recognition passed between them, two professionals speaking across a chasm of circumstance. Speckled pattern on the echo, too. I'd bet on it. Thorne looked like he had been slapped. His entire worldview, built on credentials, hierarchy, and the reassuring certainty of his own expertise, was crumbling. He looked at the janitor, at his worn uniform and his tired eyes, and then at the screen, seeing it now through a different lens. The thickened walls, the struggling squeeze. The story wasn't one of overgrowth, it was one of invasion. Suddenly, an alarm blared from Leo Dorsey's room. A shrill, insistent shriek. The V-TAC alarm. "He's in a sustained run!" Ben shouted, already moving toward the room. The group broke, rushing to the bedside. Al followed, stopping at the doorway, his self-imposed boundary. He could see the monitor over their shoulders. The patient's heart rate was over 220, the waveform a chaotic, wide complex tachycardia. His blood pressure, displayed in stark red numbers, was plummeting. 70-40, 65-38. "Push another 150 of amio," Thorne commanded. "No." Al's voice was sharp, a command, not a suggestion. It stopped the nurse in her tracks, syringe in hand. "It won't work. It'll just push him into a systole when the rhythm breaks. His heart is too sick to restart." Thorne whirled around, his face pale, his arrogance burned away by pure fear. "Then what? He's about to code." Al stepped into the room. He was no longer Al the janitor. He was Dr. Alistair Finch, and this was his domain. He's not just in VTACH, he's in electrical storm. You need to treat the underlying cause, not just the rhythm. Get me a Congo red stain kit from pathology, stat, and a sample of abdominal fat pad tissue. We need to prove it's amyloid. But we don't have time for that now. Right now, you need to stop the infiltration. The only thing that might work is a combination of bortezomib and high-dose dexamethasone. It's a chemo regimen. It's off-label for a cardiac presentation, but it's his only shot. The room was silent, save for the screaming alarm. A chemo regimen for a cardiac arrest. It was unheard of. It was insane. "We can't just—" Hansen began. "His pressure is 50 over palp," the nurse called out. "He's losing consciousness." Thorne looked at the dying boy on the bed, then at the janitor in the doorway. He saw the absolute, unshakable certainty in Al's eyes. It was the certainty of a man who had not learned this from a book, but had lived it. In this moment of crisis, credentials meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the person who knew the way out of the fire. "Do it," Thorne said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Get the dexamethasone and call oncology. Tell them we need bortezomib in the ICU. Now, tell them Dr. Thorne is authorizing it." Then he looked at Al, his eyes wide with a million questions. "And you don't go anywhere." The memory of Elena came unbidden, sharp as shattered glass. It wasn't the end he remembered now, but the beginning of the end. A Saturday afternoon, 6 years ago. They were in the garden of their home, a sprawling Tudor with ivy-covered walls that Alistair had bought with the proceeds of his first patented surgical device. The air was warm, smelling of cut grass and blooming roses. Lily, just 2 years old, was chasing butterflies on chubby, unsteady legs. Elena had been weeding her prized peonies. She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, and placed a hand over her chest. "That's funny," she'd said, her voice light. "My heart feels like it's fluttering." Alistair, sipping iced tea on the patio, had smiled. "You're just smitten with me, a common side effect." She'd laughed, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "No, it's strange, and I'm so tired, all the time." He had dismissed it. They were both in their early 40s, busy, successful. He was chief of cardiothoracic surgery at a major Boston teaching hospital. She was a celebrated cellist with the city's symphony orchestra. Tired was their default state. He told her to get more sleep, maybe take some iron. He, the man who could diagnose an aortic dissection from across a room, had prescribed rest for the beginning of the disease that would kill his wife. The guilt of that initial dismissal had been a stone in his gut ever since. Over the next few months, the symptoms accumulated, a collection of seemingly unrelated complaints. Swelling in her ankles, shortness of breath when she carried her cello case up the stairs. The fluttering became more frequent. Their family doctor diagnosed anxiety. A cardiologist he referred her to, a colleague, ran a stress test, which she passed, and an echo, which showed some mild, unremarkable thickening of the ventricular wall. He put her on a low-dose beta blocker. Alistair had been busy. A case involving separating conjoined twins who shared a pericardium had consumed him for weeks. He was publishing papers, flying to conferences, mentoring residents. He was Dr. Finch, the miracle worker. At home, he was a husband who was watching his wife fade and telling himself it was stress. He saw her fatigue, her waning appetite, but he saw it through the filter of his own exhaustion and hubris. He was the expert on hearts. If something were truly wrong with hers, wouldn't he be the first to know? The turning point came during a performance. Alistair was in the audience, a rare night off. Elena was playing the solo in Elgar's cello concerto, a piece that was as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. In the middle of the adagio, a passage of aching, transcendent beauty, her bowing arm faltered. Her breath hitched. She slumped forward, her head almost touching the strings of her instrument. The music died in a discordant scrape. The chaos that followed was a blur. The medics, the ambulance, the frantic drive to his own hospital. He had pulled rank, shouting his own name like a weapon, demanding his own team. In the ER, as they hooked her up to the monitors, He saw it. The same thing he was seeing now, years later, on a screen in St. Jude's ICU. The profoundly thickened heart walls, the low-voltage EKG, the paradox. And he knew. The realization hit him not like a lightning bolt, but like a slow, cold flood. All the disparate symptoms clicked into place. The fatigue, the swelling, the shortness of breath, the arrhythmias. It wasn't anxiety, it wasn't overwork, it was amyloidosis, the zebra, the 1 in a million diagnosis that had been hiding in plain sight. He had stood in that ER, the world's foremost cardiac surgeon, and realized he had missed the most important diagnosis of his life. He had failed the one heart he was sworn above all others to protect. Stories like this remind us that expertise can hide anywhere, and dismissing someone based on their position might mean missing the person who could save everything. If that resonates, hit like and comment where you're watching from, because what Al does next changes everything. Now, in the ICU of St. Jude's, the memory was a physical weight, pressing down on him. The oncology pharmacist arrived, a young woman with wide, confused eyes, holding the vial of bortezomib as if it were a bomb. The nurse prepped the injection, her hands moving with practiced speed, but her eyes kept flicking toward Al, then to Dr. Thorne, seeking confirmation for this madness. "Dose?" Thorne asked, his voice strained. He was deferring to the janitor, in front of his entire team. The power shift in the room was palpable, a seismic event. Al didn't hesitate. 1.3 milligrams per meter squared. His body surface area is about 2.0, so 2.6 milligrams, subcutaneous injection, and 40 milligrams of dexamethasone IV push right now. Thorne nodded to the nurse. "You heard him." As the nurse administered the steroids, Al spoke again, his voice low and urgent. "The chemo will take time to work on the amyloid production. The immediate goal of the steroids is to stabilize the cell membranes and reduce the inflammatory response. It might be enough to break the electrical storm, but you need to be ready to cardiovert him. We've shocked him twice already. He just goes right back into VTach." "Ben," the resident said, his voice shaky. "Because you were shocking him at too high a joule setting," Al countered, pointing to the defibrillator. "This isn't a normal heart, it's brittle. A high-energy shock can cause more damage, more irritability. Start low, 100 joules, biphasic, and synchronize it. You have to catch the R wave." He was teaching again, the instincts of 2 decades taking over. He wasn't just giving orders, he was explaining the why. On the monitor, the chaotic rhythm persisted. Leo's blood pressure was gone. The nurse was performing chest compressions, the rhythmic thud, a grim counterpoint to the beeping alarms. "He's in pulseless VTach, he's coded," Hansen said, her voice grim. "Charge to 100, Thorne commanded, grabbing the paddles. He looked at Al, a silent question in his eyes. Al nodded. "Synchronized, now." Thorne pressed the button. Leo's body arched off the bed, a single violent spasm. The chaotic waveform on the monitor dissolved into a flat line. Asystole. A collective gasp went through the room. The worst possible outcome. "Damn it," Thorne muttered, his face ashen. He had trusted the janitor, and the boy was dead. "Wait," Al said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Wait." For 3 agonizing seconds, the line remained flat. The long, unbroken tone of the asystole alarm was a death sentence. The nurse had stopped compressions, her face a mask of despair. And then, a tiny, hesitant blip appeared, followed by another, and another, a slow, wide, but organized rhythm. Sinus bradycardia. His heart rate was 40, but it was his own rhythm. A pulse flickered on the monitor. His blood pressure slowly, miraculously began to register. 80/50. A wave of astonished relief washed through the room. It was so quiet you could hear the soft whir of the IV pump. Ben, the resident, leaned against the wall, his legs weak. Dr. Hansen stared at the monitor, then at Al, her expression one of pure awe. Thorne lowered the paddles, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Al, his professional mask completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, humbled face of a doctor who had been pulled back from the abyss. Who are you?" he asked, the question hanging in the sterile air. Al didn't answer. He looked at the boy in the bed, whose chest was now rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He saw the faint flush of pink returning to his cheeks. He had done it. He had stepped back into the world he had forsaken, and a life had been saved. The ghost in his hand, the tremor born of failure and grief, was still. But the victory felt hollow. He had exposed himself. The comfortable, anonymous world he had built for Lily was gone. The questions were just beginning. He could already feel the foundations of his quiet life turning to dust. He had saved Leo Dorsey, but he wasn't sure if he had just destroyed Al Finney. The hours that followed were a surreal dream. Leo Dorsey was stabilized, his heart holding its own fragile rhythm. He was still critically ill, but he was alive. The immediate crisis had passed, replaced by a thick, questioning silence. The ICU staff moved around Al with a strange mixture of reverence and confusion, like he was a religious apparition. They refilled his coffee, called him Sir, and spoke in hushed tones whenever he was near. He had become a myth in the space of a single night. Dr. Thorne had taken him to his office, a large, glass-walled room with a panoramic view of the sleeping city. The desk was a slab of dark mahogany, covered in neat stacks of journals and a gleaming laptop. On the wall were framed diplomas from Harvard and Johns Hopkins, and a photo of Thorne shaking hands with the governor. It was the kind of office Alistair Finch had once occupied. "I've been making calls," Thorne said, closing the door. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp, analytical. He was a man trying to solve the most baffling puzzle of his career. There is no Al Finney with a medical license in this state, or any state. The name on your employment record, the social security number, it's all legitimate. You've been paying taxes as a janitor for 5 years, but before that, you don't seem to exist. Al sat in the leather chair opposite the desk, his gray uniform feeling absurdly out of place. He said nothing. He just watched the first hints of dawn staining the sky purple and orange. He was thinking about Lily, sleeping in her small room, and the promise he had made to be home before she woke up. But, Thorne continued, leaning forward, there was a Dr. Alistair Finch, chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Boston General, pioneer of the Finch-Takahashi procedure for aortic arch reconstruction, over 200 peer-reviewed publications, won the Lasker Prize in 2008 for his work on myocardial regeneration, a surgeon who, by all accounts, was on a path to a Nobel, a man who looked a lot like you, just with darker hair and fewer lines on his face, a man who disappeared from the medical world 5 years ago, resigned his post, let his license lapse, vanished. Right after his wife, a cellist named Elena, died from cardiac amyloidosis. Thorne let the name hang in the air. He had pieced it together. Al finally met his gaze. The weariness in his eyes was profound. "That was a different man," he said, his voice quiet. "Was it?" Thorne challenged, his voice softening with something that sounded like respect. "The man I saw in that ICU tonight, that was not a janitor. That was an expert, maybe the foremost expert on the planet on that specific horrific disease. You didn't just diagnose him, you knew the cellular mechanism. You knew the off-label treatment. You knew the exact joule setting for the defibrillator. That's not knowledge. That's experience. painful experience. Al looked down at his hands, resting on his knees. The right one was trembling again, a fine, almost invisible flutter. The ghost was back. "That man's hands don't work anymore," he said, the admission costing him a piece of his soul. He couldn't hold a scalpel steady if his life depended on it, so he ceased to exist. He had to. Thorne was silent for a long moment, processing the confession. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a deep, clinical empathy. "The tremor, it's psychogenic? From the trauma?" Al nodded, not trusting his voice. "Alistair." Thorne started, using the name like an invocation. "What you did tonight, you saved that boy's life. We would have killed him. I would have killed him. I was so fixated on the diagnosis I expected to see, I couldn't see what was right in front of me." "It's an easy mistake to make," Al said, the words hollow. "I made it myself." The raw grief in his voice silenced Thorne again. The view outside was now a brilliant, painful orange. The city was waking up. A new day was beginning, whether Al wanted it to or not. His phone vibrated. It was a text from Mrs. Gable. "Lily's up, asking for pancakes." The simple domesticity of it was like a lifeline. That was his world now. Pancakes, school runs, bedtime stories, not chemo protocols and defibrillators. He stood up. "I have to go. My daughter is expecting me." "Wait," Thorne said, standing as well. "This isn't over. The diagnosis isn't confirmed. The Congo red stain will take hours. The fat pad biopsy. We need someone who knows what to look for. The treatment plan from here, it's complex. We're in uncharted territory. I'm in uncharted territory. I need you." "You need Dr. Finch," Al corrected him. "He's not here. I'm a janitor. I have to get home." He walked to the door. He could feel Thorne's eyes on his back. He was almost free. He could walk out, go back to his life, and hope this all faded away. "We ran the genetic markers on Leo while you were in here," Thorne said, his voice stopping Al at the door. "Just on a hunch, he has a transthyretin mutation, the TTR gene. It's a hereditary form of amyloidosis, much more aggressive in the heart." Al's blood ran cold. He turned slowly. "Which mutation?" "Val122IL," Thorne said, reading from his screen. "Most common in individuals of West African descent." Al closed his eyes. It was worse than he thought. This wasn't just a random protein misfolding. It was a genetic time bomb. And it was the one form that had a specific, targeted therapy, a drug that hadn't existed when Elena was dying. "Patisiran," Al whispered. "You have to get him on patisiran. It's an RNA interference drug. It can halt the production of the mutant protein." Thorne nodded, already typing furiously. "I'm on it. But it's not that simple. We have to manage the existing amyloid load, support his heart, deal with the arrhythmias. I need a consultant. I need a guide." He looked up, his expression stripped of all pretense. "St. Jude's needs a guide. I can create a position, a new role, a diagnostic specialist, or consulting physician. Call it whatever you want. No surgical duties, no on-call nights if you want. Name your terms. Just don't disappear again. Don't let that knowledge disappear with you." It was an offer of redemption, a path back, a way to be the man he was, without the one thing he could no longer do. He could be a healer again. But all he could see was Lily's face, her gap-toothed smile in the photo on his phone. He had built a fortress of anonymity around her to protect her from the ghosts of his past. Thorne was asking him to tear it down. "I can't," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I made a promise." He opened the door and walked out, leaving Dr. Aris Thorne standing alone in his magnificent office. the morning sun glinting off the framed accolades of a life Alistair Finch had left behind. He fled the hospital, the rising sun feeling like an accusation at his back. He didn't stop until he was standing in the cramped, cluttered hallway of his apartment building, the smell of stale cooking oil and dust replacing the sterile scent of the ICU. He let himself into his apartment. It was small, a 2-bedroom rental on the 3rd floor of a walk-up. The furniture was sparse, second-hand, but the walls were covered in Lily's vibrant, chaotic drawings. A crayon rendering of a unicorn was taped to the fridge. A half-finished Lego castle sat on the coffee table. It was a home. It was their sanctuary. Lily was at the small kitchen table, still in her pajamas, carefully drawing on a piece of paper. Mrs. Gable sat with her, a half-empty cup of tea in her hands. "Daddy!" Lily's face lit up. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. "You're late. I was waiting for pancakes." Al knelt and hugged her tightly, burying his face in her hair. It smelled of kid shampoo and sleep. This was real. This was his world. The solid, warm weight of his daughter in his arms. "I'm sorry, sweet pea," he murmured. "Work was busy." Mrs. Gable gave him a knowing, gentle look. "Everything all right, Al?" "Everything's fine, Clara. Thank you," he said, forcing a smile. After Mrs. Gable left, he started the pancake batter, his movements automatic. Lily sat at the table, watching him. She was quiet for a while, just the scratch of her crayon on the paper filling the silence. "Did something happen at work?" she asked, her 8-year-old perception cutting right through his defenses. "You look different." He stopped stirring. "Different how?" "I don't know," she said, tilting her head. "Your shoulders are bigger." He didn't know what to say to that. He poured the batter onto the hot griddle, the sizzle filling the small kitchen. He flipped the pancakes, his movements sure and steady. For now, the tremor was gone. They ate in their usual comfortable silence. Lily, as always, made a smiley face on her pancake with blueberries. He watched her, his heart a complicated knot of love and fear. The offer from Thorne echoed in his mind. A new role. Name your terms. It was a tempting whisper. A chance to use the part of himself he had locked away. A chance to make the tragedy of Elena's death mean something more than just his own retreat from the world. But the fear was immense. Fear of that world's demands. Fear of the memories it would stir up. Fear of failing again. Fear, most of all, of breaking his quiet, simple life with Lily. "Daddy," Lily said, her mouth sticky with syrup. "Remember you told me about Mommy's heart?" Al stiffened. They didn't talk about the medical specifics often. "I remember." "And the doctors didn't know how to fix it?" "That's right, sweet pea." "Is it because they weren't smart enough?" He sighed, pushing his own plate away. "No, they were very smart. It was just a very tricky problem, like a puzzle with missing pieces." She looked down at her drawing. It was a picture of him. He was wearing his gray janitor's uniform, but in his hand, he wasn't holding a mop. He was holding a glowing golden heart. "Mommy used to say your hands were magic," she said softly, not looking at him. "And your brain was a supercomputer. She said you could solve any puzzle." The words were a gut punch. He could feel the sting of tears behind his eyes. "I couldn't solve that one, Lily." "But you could solve other ones, right?" she asked, finally looking up at him. Her eyes, so much like his, were clear and serious. "You could help other people who have tricky heart puzzles." He stared at her, this small person who held his entire world in her hands. She was giving him permission. More than that, she was showing him the way. His hiding wasn't just about protecting her, it was about protecting himself. He had built the walls so high he had forgotten they had a gate. If this story is proving that courage isn't about not being afraid, It's about acting anyway. Hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Because Alistair didn't stay invisible. He chose to be seen, and that choice is about to matter more than anyone expected. Would it make you happy if I did that? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. If I went back to helping people with their puzzles? She considered this with the solemnity only a child can muster. You don't smile very much, she said, a simple, devastating observation. Mommy said you used to smile all the time when you came home from the hospital, when you fixed someone. Maybe if you did that again, you would smile more. She took a bite of her pancake. And you could still make me pancakes, right? That was it. The simple, profound logic of a child. It wasn't an either/or. It was an and. He could be Dr. Finch, and he could be Daddy. Maybe he had to be both to be whole. Hiding a part of himself wasn't keeping a promise. It was teaching his daughter that the best way to deal with pain was to become smaller. Yes, sweet pea, he said, and this time a real smile touched his lips, the first in a long time. It felt like stretching a muscle he hadn't used in years. I can still make you pancakes, I promise, and I keep my promises. He looked at her drawing of him holding the glowing heart. He wasn't a superhero. He was just a man who had been given a second chance to use his gifts. He had spent 5 years mopping the floors of a world he had abandoned. Maybe it was time to stand up and help fix what was broken within its walls. Later that day, he called Dr. Thorne. Finch, Thorne answered, his voice betraying his surprise and relief. I was hoping you'd call. I've considered your offer, Al said, his voice steady. He was standing by the window in his living room, watching Lily play with her Legos on the floor. I have my terms. The transformation was gradual, not instantaneous. Alistair Finch did not simply reappear. Instead, a new person emerged, a fusion of the two men he had become. He accepted the position of Senior Diagnostic Consultant for the Department of Cardiothoracic Medicine at St. Jude's. His name on the door, at his own insistence, was simply A. Finch. Most of the staff just called him Al. He didn't wear a pristine white coat or tailored suits. He wore simple khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and comfortable shoes. Over it, he often wore a gray lab coat, a nod to the uniform he had worn for 5 years, a reminder of where he had come from. He carried no stethoscope. His tools were his eyes, his mind, and the hospital's vast digital archives. His office was not the grand, glass-walled space Thorne occupied. It was a small, functional room in the hospital's library, surrounded by shelves of old medical texts and bound journals. It was quiet, a place for thought. He insisted his hours be 9 to 4, Monday to Friday. No nights, no weekends, no on-call. He was home every night to have dinner with Lily. He never missed a school play or a parent-teacher conference. He kept his promise. At first, his presence was a curiosity. Doctors and residents would walk by his office, peering in at the former janitor, who now advised the chief of surgery. But the skepticism quickly melted away, replaced by a profound respect. Alistair didn't grandstand. He didn't flaunt his knowledge. He listened. He would join rounds, standing quietly at the back, just observing. A resident would present a difficult case, listing symptoms and test results. Thorne would lead the discussion, and then, inevitably, he would turn to the man in the corner. Al, your thoughts? And Alistair would speak. He would ask a single, incisive question that would reframe the entire problem. He'd point out a subtle detail on an imaging scan that everyone else had missed. He'd connect a patient's seemingly unrelated symptoms to a rare genetic marker he'd read about in a Swedish journal from 1987. He saw the patterns no one else did. He was the hospital's living, breathing search engine for zebras. he became a legend. The Finch rounds became a must-attend event for residents and fellows. He wasn't just diagnosing, he was teaching them how to think. "Don't just look at the data," he would say, his voice calm and patient. "Listen to the patient's story. The diagnosis is almost always hiding in the first sentence of their history, if you know how to hear it." He worked most closely with Leo Dorsey. The boy's recovery was slow and arduous. The patisiran therapy halted the production of the rogue protein, but the damage from the existing amyloid was significant. Alistair designed a complex regimen of supportive care, meticulously managing Leo's fluid balance, his medications, his diet. He spent hours talking to Leo, explaining the disease not as a death sentence, but as a chronic condition they would manage together. He gave him something the initial diagnosis had stolen: hope. Thorne, for his part, had been transformed. The experience had stripped him of his arrogance, replacing it with a humble, hungry curiosity. He became Alistair's fiercest advocate and, surprisingly, his friend. They would often have lunch in the hospital cafeteria, two of the finest medical minds of their generation, discussing complex cases over Salisbury steak and Jell-O. Thorne would marvel at Alistair's encyclopedic knowledge, and Alistair would find himself, to his surprise, enjoying the intellectual sparring. He was using his mind again, and it felt like coming home. The tremor in his hand never vanished completely. It would reappear at odd moments, when he was tired or when a case reminded him too closely of Elena. But it no longer held the same power. It was not a mark of failure anymore. It was just a scar, a reminder of the loss that had ultimately led him to this new, unexpected purpose. 3 months after that fateful night, Leo Dorsey walked out of St. Jude's. He was thin, and his running career was over, but he was alive. His heart was scarred but stable. He had enrolled in online classes, planning to study genetic counseling. On his way out, he stopped by Al's office in the library. "They told me you were the one," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "The janitor. The one who knew." Alistair stood up from his desk. "I was just in the right place at the right time." "Dr. Thorne told me what you did," Leo insisted. "He said everyone was running out of a burning building, and you were the only one who ran in and showed them where the fire extinguisher was." He held out his hand. "I don't know how to thank you for giving me my life back." Alistair looked at the boy's outstretched hand, then at his own. He reached out and shook it. His grip was firm and steady. There was no tremor. "Live a good life, Leo," he said, his voice gentle. "That's all the thanks I need." The impact of Alistair's return rippled through the institution. Thorne, with Alistair's guidance, established a new protocol at St. Jude's, the Atypical Presentation Initiative, which everyone unofficially called the Finch Protocol. It was a new diagnostic pathway for any patient who didn't fit a clear clinical picture. It forced doctors to slow down, to question their assumptions, to look for the paradoxes. A year after its implementation, the hospital reported a 15% decrease in diagnostic errors for complex cases and had successfully identified 3 other patients with rare infiltrative cardiomyopathies that would have otherwise been missed. Alistair's individual action had led to systemic change. His tragedy was now saving countless others. He was building a legacy, not of surgical firsts, but of thoughtful second looks. One Saturday morning, about a year after he had taken the job, Alistair was in his kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The apartment was the same, but it felt different, brighter. He had painted the walls a warm cream color. New, more comfortable furniture had replaced the old, mismatched pieces. On a bookshelf, beside Lily's art projects, were a few recent medical journals. Lily, now 9½, was at the table, her head bent over a school project about famous scientists. She was a different child, too. The nightmares had stopped. The quiet, anxious watchfulness in her eyes had been replaced by a confident spark. She knew where her father was. She knew he would be home. Alistair was making pancakes, the familiar sizzle filling the room. His phone rang. It was Thorne. "Al." Thorne's voice was relaxed, friendly. "Got a minute? We have a transfer from a rural clinic. 34-year-old woman, postpartum, presenting with heart failure. Echo shows a preserved EF, but she's hypotensive and her kidneys are failing. The team is thinking peripartum cardiomyopathy, but something feels off. The labs show a monoclonal protein spike." Alistair flipped a pancake, his mind already working. Postpartum, monoclonal spike, heart failure. "Check her for light chain amyloidosis, Eris," he said, without missing a beat. "It can be triggered by the stress of pregnancy. It's rare, but it fits. Get a serum-free light chain assay and a bone marrow biopsy." "Of course," Thorne said, a hint of awe still present in his voice even after a year. "Knew you'd see it. Thanks, Al. I'll let you know." Alistair hung up. It was just another Saturday. He had just guided a team toward a life-saving diagnosis from his own kitchen, the smell of pancakes in the air. He felt a profound sense of peace. He was both men at once, the brilliant diagnostician and the present father. He was whole. He brought a stack of pancakes to the table and set them in front of Lily. She had finished her project. It was a poster board with pictures of Marie Curie, Albert Einstein, and in the center, a hand-drawn picture of a man with silver-streaked hair wearing a simple button-down shirt. Underneath it, she had written in careful, block letters, "Dr. Alistair Finch, my dad. He solves puzzles." He looked at the drawing, then at his daughter, her face bright with love and pride. He finally understood. Hiding wasn't healing. Being invisible wasn't safety. True strength wasn't in avoiding the pain of the past, but in using it to build a better future. The world had taken Elena from him, and in his grief, he had almost taken himself from the world. But Lily, in her simple, unwavering wisdom, had called him back. If this story reminded you that hiding isn't the same as healing, and that being truly seen is worth the risk, subscribe, share, and comment below. Because somewhere right now, someone is hiding gifts the world needs. Maybe this story will remind them to step forward. He sat down across from her, a real, easy smile on his face. He picked up his fork. On the wall, a framed photo of Elena, her head thrown back in laughter, seemed to catch the morning light. He looked at it, a silent conversation passing between them. "I'm keeping my promise, Elle. Both of them." He was no longer just a father hiding from his past, or a doctor mourning his future. He was Alistair Finch, and he was home.